I'm Bob Henderson. I'm the Nomad Dad. I'm going to do a two-part series titled Western Leaders Live in a Fantasy World. And sadly, too many of their acolytes do as well. I'm a pragmatic guy. I'm for what works. I'm not a pie-in-the-sky guy. So I'm looking at 4 issues around the world that I think resonate in most of the Western countries and resonate in a pretty big way. So they would be the Green Revolution, crime, immigration, and of course, the financial situation. If you look at the West and then add in Japan, who is just an absolute basket case with their modern monetary theory over the last 30 years, it is not a good trend. The world is awash in debt, not only at the governmental level, but also at the corporate and personal level in most of these countries. So let's talk about green first off. I'm going to say something that some people are not going to like. I don't think we have a climate emergency. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't pursue some kind of change in our energy policy. But to think that we can ban the internal combustion engine 10 years from now, I think is ludicrous because we don't have the infrastructure in place to do that. Can we by 2050? Maybe not. Later on, perhaps. And if we let the free market work, perhaps there will come an invention that is not even a twinkling in our eye at this point that will change everything in favor of something different than what we have energy-wise. But until that happens, I think what we have to do is stay the course. With the fossil fuels, sadly, I think the air is a lot cleaner in a lot of places than it used to be. But to go back to something that we are not ready for, you're going to put the world back 200 years. And I don't think most people are going to go for that. Now, Here's what I think. If there truly were a climate emergency, would Biden be going home on Air Force One every weekend? I doubt it. Would John Kerry, this so-called climate czar, be flying on private airplanes along with his other climate czar friends to conferences all over the world? I doubt it. Would the corporate executives and movie stars be flying on their private airplanes if there truly was a climate emergency that they're talking about? Until this changes, I'm not convinced. Do we have some issues? It's possibly warming. Is it to the point where it's an emergency? I'm not convinced. The average person that is polled in North America says that they would be willing to spend an extra $10 a month on average to fight quote-unquote climate change. That ain't going to get it done. I mean, not even close. In the next episode, I'm going to give you some examples of reality beginning to bite with consumers because some of these solutions, they're all subsidized, but they're not free. And I think you're going to begin to see some pushback. In fact, in some countries, you already are. I think you're beginning to see pushback at the ballot box on some of the green policies and on some of the immigration policies, particularly in Europe at this point. I'll give you examples in the next episode. The second one is crime. So we have elected in the United States all kinds of prosecutors that don't want to uphold the law. So you really don't need to change the laws. You just need prosecutors who won't enforce the law. And you are seeing the effects of that in our major cities. San Francisco among them, Chicago, New York City, Washington, D.C., where Congress people and staffers are being assaulted and being held up at gunpoint and their cars being hijacked, carjacked. This is happening in the nation's capital. You were seeing it in Chicago. You were seeing it in New York City. The mayor there, who's a former higher up in the police department in the city of New York. But if you're going to have a district attorney who will not enforce the law, it's not going to get fixed. And this is where leadership is living in a fantasy land. How can you allow people to steal? And I think in California, you can take $950 before you get maybe a traffic ticket and you're out on bail an hour or two later. if you're apprehended at all. So these stores now abandon the city center, and it becomes a food desert. And Chicago now has come up with a brilliant idea of, well, we'll just have our own city-owned grocery stores. Well, the reason the other stores aren't there is because there was too much crime, there was theft, the employees were endangered, the customers were endangered. It ain't going to be any different if you just slap a different name on the store and say it's owned by the city of Chicago, and poof, everything is just hunky-dory. It isn't going to work that way. Immigration. So I think legal immigration is a wonderful thing. It's just an absolutely wonderful thing, and the American ideal is built on that. But I think it should be legal, and I think to some extent it should be limited on a yearly basis. And wouldn't it be nice if we would allow people to come into the country on the visa that promotes people with special abilities? So they could be tech abilities, they could be doctors, they could be this, they could be that. Let's get more of those people in the country. We have a shortage. We need more of those kinds of people in the country. But we're not seeing that. And so some of these cities became sanctuary cities. Sounds good. That's what a lot of this is. It sounds good until it hits home. And now in New York City, they are begging the federal government for more money because all the influx they can't accommodate. Same thing in Chicago, same thing in Washington, D.C., same thing in other cities. If you're inviting these people to come and you're going to welcome them, what do you think is going to happen? But now reality is biting in the rear end. And then, of course, there's financial. I cannot believe that we would have such ludicrous debate on the finances of the country, not just in the U.S. I mentioned modern monetary theory has been tried for decades now in Japan. You've got a stagnant stock market. It's the same place roughly it was 30 years ago. Their economy barely grows, if at all. And they have a huge demographic problem, and which is one of the reasons they just spent. They had 30 years ago, their debt to GDP was about 50%. Now it's close to 250%. Place is going to implode because they don't allow immigration. That's where that would come into play. But modern monetary theory in the U.S. And so you have the author of the book, Stephanie Kelton, saying, well, we should have, quote unquote, nice things. And so we can spend because we're the reserve currency and it's never going to be a problem. And I hear members of Congress say this, and you've got to be kidding me. Did you have a brain transplant last night? I mean, at some point, we're now to the point where the interest on the debt is approaching $1 trillion a year. A year! And this is going to begin to crowd out all the other spending unless you want to have a lot of inflation, because you're going to have to keep paying Social Security and Medicare recipients, or you'll never be in office any longer. And we're getting pretty close to the day of reckoning. I don't know how long. Could be 5 years, could be 10, could be 10 months. I don't know. But it cannot go on forever. Trees do not grow to the sky. Who was it? Herb Stein in the Nixon administration, Ben Stein's father, by the way. What can't go on forever won't. I mean, that was his quote. He's absolutely right. So you've got this nonsense of the green policies. And by the way, $150 trillion is what they want to spend over the next 30 years. Janet Yellen, U.S. Treasury Secretary, testified to this effect 2 years ago, so it's probably higher. $150 trillion globally. Chuck Schumer, if the Democrats win the White House and Congress next year, want to spend $2 trillion in addition to what we already spend and have a $2 trillion deficit on. They want to add $2 trillion extra for their green donors. To continue with policies of subsidizing these companies, and many of them just not surviving, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next episode. Jamie Dimon, chairman of Chase Bank, says this is the most dangerous time in decades. Fed chairman Jerome Powell, the current fiscal path is not sustainable, yet these people are living in Congress, many of them, both parties, living in a fantasy world. I'll explore this a little bit more in the next episode. These are the existential issues of our time. I'm Bob Henderson. on the Nomad Dad.